Have you ever wondered what happens when a town loses its faith? When pain takes root so deeply that even the earth stops giving, the rain stops falling, and hope becomes just a memory. Welcome to Promise, Texas, a town once filled with dreams, now drowning in despair. But what if I told you that in the ashes of grief, in a place so broken that even prayer seemed silent, God was already writing a miracle? It all began with a single heart-wrenching cry, the cry of a mother, Ellen, caught in a moment no parent should ever face. A complicated labor. A child never meant to see the light of this world. And with that, a womb that would never again give life. One moment shattered a future. One scream echoed through the walls of a hospital room and into the very soul of a town already on the brink of collapse. Ellen survived, but not without a cost so heavy it nearly broke her. And then came the silence. Not just in Ellen's home, but across the entire town of Promise. The heavens closed up. The skies forgot how to cry. Crops withered and died in the fields. Storefronts were boarded shut. Sickness swept in like a fog, stealing strength from the strong and hope from the hopeful. Families left. Businesses crumbled. And those who remained, they weren't living. They were merely surviving, dragging themselves through each day under a weight that only deepened with time. It was as if a curse had descended upon the land, a divine silence, a spiritual drought deeper than the dust beneath their feet. And the question whispered from porch to porch, pulpit to pulpit, heart to heart, where is God? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why here? Why now? Why Promise? But oh, dear friends, isn't that just when he moves? In the quiet, in the stillness, in the hopelessness, God prepares his miracles. This story isn't just about tragedy. It's about what comes next. It's about the light that follows the darkest night. Because even when we feel abandoned, even when heaven seems quiet, God is already sending his answer. And in the case of Promise, he sent it in the most unexpected form. A dusty road, a small boy with no name, and a mat rolled beneath his arm. But before the miracles began, before rain fell, before the blind could see, before the dead breathed again, it all started with a woman's scream and a town that lost its way. This is the beginning of I Am Gabriel. This is the story of how one broken moment became the doorway for divine redemption. Stay with us, because what you're about to witness is nothing short of heaven touching earth. In the quiet outskirts of a small town, where the wind whispered secrets through the tall grass and the sun cast a golden hue over every humble home, something extraordinary unfolded. Something that would leave an imprint on every soul who came near it. One evening, as the sky glowed like fire and the earth seemed to pause in anticipation, a boy appeared. He was alone, walking barefoot along the dusty road that led nowhere and everywhere. No one knew where he had come from. He had no suitcase, no family, no history. Just a simple name that he spoke softly when asked, Gabe. It was Ellen who first saw him from her porch, knitting in the fading light. Her husband Joe came out to refill the bird feeder, and together they watched the boy's figure approach like a vision from another world. He couldn't have been more than 12, with bright, searching eyes that held both the wisdom of the old and the ache of the forgotten. Though he looked tired, there was a peace about him that didn't match his condition. Joe called out, "Hey there, son. You lost?" But the boy only shook his head and replied in a voice both gentle and strong, "No, sir. Just walking. I'm supposed to be here." Though puzzled, Ellen and Joe were good people, church-going folks with open hearts. They took Gabe in, offered him warm food, a place to sleep, and clothes that Joe's late nephew had left behind. Gabe accepted it all with quiet gratitude, always saying thank you, always with a glimmer of something divine in his smile. From the start, there was something about Gabe that unsettled and inspired. He spoke with a depth far beyond his years. He would say things that made grown men weep and hardened hearts soften. When Ellen shared her grief over a child she'd lost long ago, Gabe touched her hand and said, "He's with God." He was never alone. She never told Gabe about that son, not once. But somehow he knew. Gabe never asked for anything, never complained. He helped around the house, tended the garden, read the Bible without prompting, and prayed at dawn and dusk. The townsfolk began to notice him too. He walked through the farmer's market, and people said they felt lighter after he passed. One man, who had not spoken since his wife died, suddenly opened up after a brief exchange with Gabe, weeping and laughing at once. Children, usually wild and unkind to newcomers, followed Gabe as though he were a shepherd and they his lambs. Even the town pastor, a skeptical man of firm doctrine, said after a Sunday visit with Gabe, "That boy speaks truth as if he were carved from it." As weeks passed, stories spread. Some said Gabe was an angel. Others whispered he was a prophet. One old woman said she dreamed of a boy with light in his voice the night before Gabe came. "The Lord sent him," she claimed. Joe didn't know what to think. He believed in God, yes, and he believed in the mysterious ways the Lord worked. But Gabe was something he couldn't explain with reason or scripture alone. Still, he never questioned the peace that now hung over their home like a warm blanket. There was one night, particularly cold and quiet, when Gabe sat by the fireplace, reading aloud from the book of Isaiah. His voice echoed softly, and the flames seemed to rise in rhythm with the holy words. He read, "And a little child shall lead them." Joe, sitting nearby, looked at him with new eyes. "Are you that child?" he asked. Gabe smiled and said nothing, but there was no need for words. The truth hung in the air like incense. In my own reflection, I believe that Gabe's story echoes many biblical moments: the sudden arrival of a stranger, the test of hospitality, the mysterious presence of the divine in the form of the lowly. Hebrews 13:2 says, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Could it be that Gabe was such a visitor? A messenger wrapped in flesh and dust, walking not just into a town, but into the souls of those ready to receive him. The way he understood grief, fear, regret, all the quiet things we keep buried, was not of this world. It was as if he saw the soul directly, bypassing the noise we use to protect ourselves. People who met Gabe didn't just feel better, they changed. The drunk put down his bottle. The adulterer confessed and made amends. The lonely widow opened her doors again. Gabe never judged, never scolded. He simply saw people wholly and completely and loved them in a way that made them want to become who they were meant to be. And yet, Gabe never spoke of where he was from. When Ellen asked him gently one night, he looked into the stars and said, "Some places don't need names. You only need to know I came when I was called." That night, Ellen dreamt of a white-robed figure in a field of lilies, holding a lamp that never dimmed. When she awoke, tears streamed down her face, and she whispered a prayer she hadn't said since her mother died. There is power in the idea that the divine chooses the humble path to walk among us. Gabe was no grand preacher, no miracle worker with thunder in his hands. He was quiet, simple, pure. Just like Jesus, who was born in a manger, not a palace, who rode a donkey, not a steed. Sometimes God sends his messages not with fire, but with stillness. Not with a trumpet, but with a whisper. And if you're not listening closely, you'll miss it. Looking back, I believe Gabe wasn't just a story. He was a reminder. a calling to return to compassion, to faith, to the sacred simplicity of loving one another. Perhaps we all meet a Gabe in our lives, someone who walks in and changes everything, not with force, but with presence. Someone who asks nothing but gives everything. Ellen and Joe's lives were never the same after Gabe, and one day, just as suddenly as he arrived, Gabe was gone. No note. No goodbye. Just an open window and the sound of morning birds echoing through the trees. But they weren't sad. They knew. Just as he had been sent, he had been called away again. Perhaps to another town, another heart in need. Even now, years later, when Ellen lights a candle in the evening and Joe hums old hymns on the porch, they feel Gabe's spirit. In the way the wind moves gently through the leaves, in the way strangers smile just a bit brighter when passing their gate. And in those quiet moments of stillness, they remember that sometimes heaven walks the earth in bare feet and borrowed clothes, carrying nothing but light in its eyes. In the quiet heart of a forgotten town, scorched by drought and silence, where the dust had settled even on the spirits of the people, there came a boy named Gabe. He wasn't from around there, at least not from anywhere the townsfolk could name. But he came with a peace in his eyes and a voice that carried not authority, but something deeper, something like truth, wrapped in gentleness. He walked with no entourage, bore no titles, and yet there was a quiet power in the way he moved through the streets, greeting the weary and the worn with a kindness that disarmed even the most skeptical hearts. It began subtly, as God often works, through whispers instead of shouts. Gabe didn't arrive with lightning or trumpets, but with a humble presence that seemed to stir something ancient in the soul, something people had buried beneath their routines and their pain. He started by speaking with Ellen, an older widow who led a small group of women from the town. They were women of faith, but their hope had grown tired. Their prayers had become ritual, not expectation. But Gabe, with that quiet assurance, urged them to return to the intimacy of prayer, not just for themselves, but for everyone. He suggested something simple, yet profound, a prayer rug. Not one for any single person, but a communal tapestry, woven together by the hands of the faithful, each thread a prayer, each knot a plea to heaven. "Let it be our offering," Gabe said, "a visible cry to the invisible God." And so they began. The women gathered thread by thread, stitch by stitch, pouring into that rug their longings and sorrows and the unspoken prayers they hadn't dared utter in years. Children brought scraps of cloth, elders shared stories as they worked, and little by little, what had begun as a task became a movement. Hearts opened as hands moved, tears fell as memories were shared. It was not just a prayer rug, it became a witness to their rediscovered unity and faith. Then came the rain. It had not fallen for many months. The earth was cracked, the wells nearly dry, and the farmers had long stopped planting. People had learned to live with thirst, with empty fields, with eyes cast downward to avoid confronting the dryness of both land and spirit. But that morning, Gabe had prayed, not theatrically, not loudly, but with sincerity that felt like it reached past the clouds. He stood by the rug now rich with the prayers of a people learning to hope again, and simply lifted his hands. He thanked God, not for what was to come, but for his presence already with them. Then, without warning, the sky groaned and broke open. Rain came, not a drizzle, not a fleeting shower, but a heavy, generous downpour that soaked the ground and the people alike. Children screamed with laughter, elders wept openly, and the air was filled with the sound of joy rediscovered. It was a miracle, plain and simple. But to those who had begun to believe again, it was more than that. It was confirmation. "Ask, and it will be given to you," said Jesus in Matthew 7:7, and here it was, a prayer answered with abundance. But perhaps the most astonishing moment came not from the sky, but from a place of deep human pain. Cameron, a young girl once full of life and dreams, had been lost to the dark grip of addiction. Her story was one all too familiar in towns like this. Bright youth dimmed by despair, promises broken under the weight of temporary escape. One evening, word spread quickly that she had overdosed. The townspeople gathered in mourning. They were too used to funerals, too accustomed to the ache of what might have been. But Gabe was there, and he knelt beside her, laying hands on her cold frame, whispering prayers that were half tears, half declarations. No one spoke. They watched, torn between hope and fear. Minutes passed. Then, in a moment that felt like eternity unfolding, Cameron stirred. She gasped, eyes flying open, and sat up. The poison in her veins was gone. The death that had gripped her released its hold. She was alive, not just breathing, but whole. It was not the kind of healing that left questions. It was complete. The town stood in stunned silence. No one could explain it. Doctors confirmed there was no trace of the drugs in her body. Scientists might have called it a phenomenon, but those who were there knew the truth. It was resurrection power. It was as if the story of Lazarus had stepped out of Scripture and into their streets. This moment became a turning point. The questions began to mount. Who was this boy? How could someone so young carry such authority, such compassion, such power? He never claimed to be anyone. When asked, he would simply smile and redirect the glory to God. "It is not me," he would say, echoing the words of Peter in Acts 3:12, "but the name of Jesus Christ and faith in him that brings healing." Yet the people could not help but wonder. Some whispered that he was an angel. Others thought perhaps he was a prophet. A few even dared to believe that he was something more. But Gabe never sought recognition. He only encouraged. He urged them to forgive, to love, to see each other through the eyes of heaven. He spoke of a God who saw them, who had never left, even when they had stopped looking. His words weren't sermons. They were stories, parables from his own journey that seemed to mirror the very scriptures they had forgotten. He didn't preach fire and brimstone. He spoke of grace, of redemption, of the kind of love that waits at the edge of the road for the prodigal child to return. And as he spoke, hearts shifted. The mayor began attending prayer gatherings. The local bar saw fewer patrons and more confessions. Families estranged for decades embraced in tears. It wasn't just religion returning to the town, it was life. I remember watching all this unfold, and I couldn't help but reflect on how often we overlook the ordinary when we seek the divine. Gabe didn't come with fanfare. He came in simplicity. And yet, through his obedience, through his unwavering faith, the miraculous broke into the mundane. It reminded me of Elijah on Mount Carmel, not in the fire or the earthquake, but in the still, small voice. That's where God moves. And that's what Gabe carried. The still, small voice of heaven, walking among the broken and breathing hope into them. Some may doubt. Some may scoff. That's always been the case when heaven touches earth. But for those who saw, who felt the rain on their skin after months of nothing but dust, who witnessed Cameron rise from the grip of death, who wove their prayers into a tapestry of faith, they know, they remember. And their lives have never been the same. In a quiet town cradled by the gentle hands of time, where the streets whispered memories and the air held the scent of old prayers and forgotten dreams, there lived a man and a woman, Ellen and Joe. To the world, they seemed content. They were faithful attendees of church, kind neighbors, good citizens. They said grace before meals, bowed their heads when others prayed, and sang hymns with familiar voices. But behind closed doors, behind smiles worn like Sunday best, something was missing. Their hearts, once soft and tender toward God, had grown numb from the repetition of religion. They had not turned away from God, no, but somewhere along the way, their walk had become a ritual march, their worship a routine. They knew of God, they spoke His name, but they did not walk with Him anymore, not like they once did when the fire was new. They had forgotten how it felt to be undone in His presence, to cry tears that only heaven could understand, to hear Him in the silence of the soul. But the Lord, ever merciful, does not forget His people, even when they forget how to reach for Him. And so, into this sleepy town, into the quiet ache of hearts too weary to even ask for revival, He sent a messenger, not in the form of a grand prophet or a roaring preacher, but in the form of a child, a boy named Gabe. Gabe was no ordinary child. He did not draw attention to himself with miracles or loud declarations. He simply was. Wherever he went, peace seemed to follow, like the gentle breeze that comes before dawn. His eyes held a depth far beyond his years, as though he had walked through eternity and returned with stories too holy for words. He did not preach from pulpits or hold revivals. He sat with the lonely, listened to the unheard, and loved those who had long given up on being loved. It was in the stillness of His presence that change began. Ellen met him first, on a day like any other. She had gone out to buy groceries, her mind filled with errands, her heart numb from years of going through the motions. And then she saw him, sitting on a bench, feeding birds, humming a hymn she hadn't heard since childhood. Their eyes met. There was no thunder, no divine voice booming from the heavens. Just a child's eyes meeting a woman's forgotten soul. "Do you remember," he asked gently, "what it feels like to really know God?" That night, Ellen couldn't sleep. His words echoed through her like a song she used to know, stirring memories of nights spent crying before the Lord, of moments when His presence was so real she could almost touch it. Joe noticed the change first in Ellen, then in himself. She began to rise early, not from obligation, but from longing. She opened her Bible again, not just to read, but to listen. She prayed not with polished words, but with raw honesty. Joe, moved by this shift in his wife, found his own heart being softened. They began to talk again, not about work or bills, but about faith, about their souls, about the dreams they had once dared to believe God had planted in them. They began to cry together, worship together, hope together. And through it all, Gabe came and went, never asking for attention, always pointing them quietly toward the Father. He was like a lamp in the night, not blinding, but enough to help them see the path once more. But Gabe's mission wasn't only for the faithful. He came for the broken, the scarred, the ones who had thrown their faith aside like a coat no longer needed. There was a little girl named Lucy, blind from birth. Her parents had prayed, cried, pleaded with doctors and pastors alike. Nothing changed. They had stopped hoping, not out of anger, but from heartbreak too heavy to carry. One day, Gabe visited them. He said nothing profound, just held Lucy's hand and smiled. He gave them a small vial of oil, whispered something only Lucy could hear, and left. That night, as the oil touched her eyes, Lucy blinked. Once, twice, and then screamed, not from pain but from the shock of light. She could see. Her mother fell to her knees, weeping. Her father stood frozen, undone by joy too great for words. The town was stirred, whispers of miracles began to spread, but Gabe refused attention. He would say only, "It is not me. It's the one who sent me." Not everyone was quick to believe. Sheriff Brody, a man of logic and law, had long abandoned the idea of miracles. Years ago, he had lost his wife in a tragic accident. He had prayed, begged, offered everything to God, but she died. Since then, he wore his badge like a shield, his silence like armor. Faith became something for others, something weak people clung to. When he heard of Gabe, he was suspicious. Too many miracles, too many unexplained happenings. To him, Gabe was a fraud, a clever trickster playing with desperate hearts. He began to investigate, to follow Gabe, question those he had touched. He found no evidence of trickery, but that only made him more suspicious. Snake oil salesman, he muttered to himself. There's always a catch. Yet Gabe did not avoid Brody. In fact, he sought him out. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in crimson and gold, Gabe approached the sheriff sitting alone in his office. "You're angry," Gabe said quietly. Brody looked up, startled. "You lost someone, and you think God didn't care?" Brody said nothing. Gabe sat across from him. "I didn't come to prove anything to you. I came to tell you he still loves you, even when you're furious, even when you stopped believing." Brody's jaw clenched. "If he loved me, she wouldn't have died." Gabe nodded slowly. "I know. Pain like that can bury a man. But she's not gone. Not really. She's home. And you're still here. Because your story isn't over." Brody didn't respond, but something cracked in him that night. Not a conversion, not a confession, but the first crack in a wall built high and deep. As days turned into weeks, more miracles happened. A woman healed of cancer, a marriage restored, a runaway teen brought back home. But the greatest miracle wasn't in the healing of bodies, it was in the healing of hearts. People began to forgive old wounds, let go of grudges held for decades. Fathers apologized to sons, neighbors reconciled. Church pews filled not from obligation but from hunger. Worship became raw and real again. Voices lifted not in performance but in desperation and awe. The town, once polite in its religion, now pulsed with the presence of God. And Gabe? He simply continued, always pointing upward, never accepting credit. He spoke often of faith, not as a feeling, but as a decision to trust, even when nothing made sense. "Faith is the soil where healing grows," he would say. "Not because we earn miracles, but because we make space for them." One evening, Gabe disappeared. No one saw him leave, but somehow everyone felt it. There was a stillness, like after a mighty wind has passed. People gathered, wondering if he would return. But he had left them something greater than his presence. He had reawakened their hearts to the presence of God. Ellen and Joe, now leaders in their church, no longer lived for Sunday mornings alone. Their home became a place of prayer, of counsel, of stories shared over tears and laughter. Brody, though still rough around the edges, began to attend church quietly in the back row. He didn't say much, but he listened. Sometimes he would stand outside afterward, staring at the sky, as if remembering a love he thought he had lost. The town was never the same. Not because of the miracles, but because they had met a boy who reminded them of the God who never left. And so the story lives on, not in books or headlines, but in hearts forever marked by grace. For sometimes God sends fire, and sometimes he sends a whisper. Sometimes he parts the sea, and sometimes he sends a child named Gabe to sit with us until we remember how to believe again. Once, in a place almost forgotten by maps, and certainly forgotten by time, there was a town called Promise. It sat quietly between hills that rolled like old prayers whispered and never quite finished. The people there moved through life as if they were ghosts inside their own skin, walking, working, breathing, but no longer truly living. The laughter that once echoed down the streets had been swallowed by years of disappointments. The church bell had rusted into silence. The prayers, when spoken, were more like habit than hope, as if they weren't sure anyone was listening. And yet God had not forgotten them, for in his perfect timing, when the soil of their souls had cracked from thirst, he sent a child. No grand entrance. No angels singing in the sky. Just a boy, no older than 10, with eyes deeper than oceans and a quietness that made the world lean in. His name was Gabe. No one could remember seeing him before, but somehow no one questioned where he came from. It was as if he'd always been there, hiding in plain sight, like something holy that had waited for the right moment to be seen. Gabe didn't speak much, and when he did, it felt like the words had been dipped in light. He wasn't loud or demanding. He simply walked where he was needed, and miracles walked with him. But the first miracle, the one that broke the dam of disbelief in the hearts of the townspeople, happened on an afternoon that seemed just like any other. Lucy was a little girl, blind from birth. She had the kind of blindness doctors call permanent, the kind that science gives up on. Her parents had taken her to every hospital they could find until their hope wore out, long before their shoes did. She had learned to live without seeing, learned to laugh at sounds, to picture colors in her imagination, to find joy in a world she had never seen with her eyes. And yet, deep in her heart, she had once prayed, as only a child can pray, that one day she would open her eyes and see the sky. That one day, she'd know what her mother's face looked like when she smiled. That prayer, whispered in the secrecy of night, had been carried like a letter sealed in tears, not lost, only waiting. That afternoon, Gabe walked up to Lucy with something in his hand. A small vial of oil, clear and unremarkable to the human eye, but shimmering with something more if you looked closely. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't call a crowd or ring a bell. He simply knelt, gently touched the oil to her eyelids, and whispered, "Lucy, blink." She did. Once. Twice. And then she gasped. At first, she thought it was light. Then shapes. Then colors. And finally, faces. Her mother, the sky, the grass, the people around her, all the things she'd only ever dreamed of, were there, real, alive, radiant. The miracle was immediate. The reaction was not. The people froze, stunned into silence as her parents fell to their knees, sobbing not out of fear, but awe. The doctor stood there, helpless and humbled. His hands, trained and steady, trembled. "It's not possible," he said under his breath. But it was. And the people of promise knew in their bones that something holy had stirred among them. But Gabe didn't stay by Lucy's side to receive praise. He walked away quietly, slipping back into the rhythm of the town like a whisper that only the heart can hear. And from that moment on, promise began to change. Slowly at first. A few people dusted off old Bibles. A few whispered prayers before bed. Some lit candles again. But Gabe reminded them gently and without pride that faith was not found in routine. "Speak to him," he would say. "Not with ceremony, but with your soul. Don't perform for him. Be real with him." That message, simple and pure, spread like warmth in winter. The people, once numb from years of spiritual coldness, began to thaw. They started making prayer carpets, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Old blankets, stitched with care, placed on kitchen floors and living room corners, became altars. Families gathered, knees bent, tears flowed. Not always in sorrow, but in gratitude, in longing, in joy. The town began to glow, not with lights, but with something deeper, a soft, sacred fire in the soul of the people. They had not found religion. They had found relationship. And in doing so, they found God again. Ellen, who had lost her husband 3 winters ago and with him all desire to smile, found herself humming hymns as she watered her garden. "It's like my soul woke up," she told a neighbor, blinking back tears. Joe, who used to sit alone on the porch with nothing but whiskey and war memories for company, began to read scripture out loud to his grandchildren. The heaviness in his eyes had lifted, and perhaps most astonishing of all was Cameron. Cameron was the girl everyone had given up on. Addicted, angry, always on the edge of something dangerous. They said she had overdosed and died, and for a moment she did. Her breath stopped. Her heart stopped. But someone said no. She came back, not just alive, but changed. She walked into church one Sunday, the same place she once cursed and mocked, and stood before the people. Her voice cracked as she said, "I was gone. I saw darkness. I felt the weight of my choices. But I heard a voice say, 'This is not the end.'" Her testimony wasn't rehearsed, but it didn't need to be. It was raw, real. Redemption wrapped in flesh. And when she spoke, people wept not out of pity, but out of the overwhelming realization that God still moves, that even the most broken can be restored. And I must tell you, as someone who has walked through deserts of doubt, who has screamed prayers into the void and waited years for whispers, this story is more than a tale. It is a mirror. It reminds us that miracles are not confined to ancient scrolls or distant lands. They happen in towns like Promise. They happen in the quiet places, in the homes of the weary, in the souls of the lost. They happen when one child dares to carry light into darkness. Gabe never claimed to be special. He never asked to be followed. But in his presence, you felt the nearness of heaven. He wasn't there to build a platform. He was there to point the way. And he did, with every gentle word, every touch, every moment of silence that somehow said more than sermons. He reminded them, and reminds us, that God never stopped listening. We just stopped speaking from the heart. Sometimes I wonder if Gabe was even a boy, or perhaps he was an angel, or even a messenger from somewhere beyond what we can comprehend. But perhaps he was simply a vessel, a reminder that God still chooses the unlikely, the unnoticed, the humble to do his greatest work. And I believe that as long as there are Lucys in the world, children who dare to pray for the impossible, as long as there are Camerons wandering in the dark and waiting for a voice to say, "This is not the end," then there will always be miracles. Maybe you're from a town like Promise. Maybe your faith has grown cold. Maybe you've prayed until your voice gave out and still felt nothing change. But if Gabe taught me anything, it's that sometimes the miracle doesn't start with the answer. It starts with the return, the turning back to the one who never left. The willingness to kneel again, not out of obligation, but because your soul aches for something more. So let this story wrap around your heart like a blanket on a cold night. Let it stir the embers you thought had died. Let it remind you, not in thunder or fire, but in the still, small whisper, that heaven is closer than you think. All it takes is one blink, one prayer, one child with oil and faith, and the world begins to change. And so it was, in a town no different from 1,000 others scattered across the hills and plains, that something holy began to unfold, quietly, gently, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was not announced by trumpets, nor did it ride in on clouds of glory. It began with a boy, or at least that is what he appeared to be. He was called Gabe, just Gabe. No last name, no history, no family. He arrived like the morning mist, sudden, silent, and yet somehow expected, like something long forgotten finally returning home. The people didn't know what to make of him. Children warmed to him instinctively, as they often do with truth, before it is taught out of them. The elderly said he reminded them of someone they once knew, though they couldn't say who. And then there was Sheriff Brody, a man who had seen more loss than love in recent years, who had buried not only criminals and crimes, but also the dearest part of his own soul, his wife. Her passing left him with a grief that didn't weep, but waited, always. It lived behind his eyes, in the clench of his jaw, in the way he looked at the world as though daring it to hurt him again. He saw Gabe not as a blessing, but a question mark. Something didn't fit. A boy with no records, no relatives, no trail. Brody searched. Oh, how he searched. He called in favors, opened dusty files, questioned every system he trusted, and came up with nothing. It was as if Gabe had been plucked from the air, made of stardust and light, and dropped quietly into their world. Brody's suspicion wasn't cruelty, it was armor. His heart, shattered and hastily stitched together, could not afford to believe in miracles. Not anymore. And so he watched Gabe with eyes honed by tragedy, waiting for the mask to slip, for the lie to show, for the boy to falter. But Gabe never faltered. Instead, he came to Brody, not with defense, not with justification, but with gentleness. "You carry a weight," he said one day, under the hush of the afternoon sun. "You think if you let it go, you'll lose her again. But it's not your grief that keeps her close. It's your love, and love never dies." Brody said nothing. He just stared, his hand twitching, as if reaching for something he could not name. Gabe looked into his eyes, not as a child looks at an adult, but as one soul gazes into another, and added, "The pain you carry, the questions, the doubt, they don't make you less worthy. The Lord has not forgotten you." And then he walked away, leaving the sheriff with tears that refused to fall and a silence that spoke louder than any siren. Then came the day of the crash. It was a regular Tuesday, the kind that promises nothing and delivers even less. Chad, a man most had written off years ago, was barreling down the old highway, lost in thoughts too heavy for his heart to carry. Once he had been full of fire and dreams. Once he had a family. But time and choices, bitterness and broken promises had taken all that from him. His car skidded on a curve known for its cruelty, and in a heartbeat, metal twisted, glass shattered, and the world turned upside down. People say Gabe was there before the dust settled. They say he reached into the wreck with hands that should have trembled, but didn't. He pulled Chad out as if guided by something unseen. And when Chad opened his eyes, he didn't just see the sky. He saw hope. "I don't know what happened," he later whispered. "But when he touched me, I remembered who I was supposed to be." And from that day on, Chad was changed. Not in some dramatic movie scene, not with fireworks or speeches, but in the way he walked slower, listened longer, and looked others in the eyes as if seeing them for the first time. But joy, like day, must eventually give way to sorrow. And soon after, death came once more. Doc, the old man who had delivered babies and sat beside the dying, who knew every family's story and carried them all in his wrinkled hands, passed away in his sleep. The town, already frayed at the edges by the strange and the sacred, came together in mourning. They gathered in the church that had seen both weddings and funerals, both faith and doubt. They came not just to grieve Doc, but to understand, to seek meaning in a world that often gives none. And Gabe was there, quiet as always, sitting in the back until someone called him forward. And it was then that Sheriff Brody, whose soul had been wrestling with something too large for law and too deep for reason, stood and spoke. Not out of anger this time, but out of desperation. "We've all been dancing around the question," he said. "We've all seen the things you've done, the way people change around you, the peace that follows you like a shadow. So tell me, who are you really?" And in that old church, under the dusty beams and the stained glass light, time seemed to pause. Gabe walked forward. He didn't preach. He didn't declare. He simply spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of the room. "I am no one," he said, "and I am everyone. I was sent, not to be seen but to remind, to whisper what has always been true, that you are loved beyond measure, and you have never been forgotten. Even when you turned your face away, even when you gave up, heaven did not." He spoke of love, not the kind we barter with or earn, but the kind that exists because it is. He spoke of faith, not as a rule book, but as a relationship. He spoke of death, not as an ending, but a returning. And as he spoke, something ancient stirred in those listening. Tears flowed freely, not because of grief, but because the truth has a way of breaking us open in the best way. It was as if every wound had been seen, every scar honored, every doubt welcomed without judgment. People said later that they felt lighter, as though years of shame and regret had been quietly lifted, not erased, but redeemed. What struck me most as I reflect on this story is that Gabe never once asked to be believed. He never demanded faith. He simply lived in a way that made disbelief uncomfortable. He didn't perform miracles to impress. He just showed up when people needed hope the most. And isn't that what we all long for? Not grand gestures, but presence. Not answers, but someone to sit beside us in our pain and say, "You're not alone." Sheriff Brody, for all his doubt, became the mirror we hold to ourselves. How often do we reject grace because we cannot explain it? How often do we miss the divine because it doesn't fit our expectations? Gabe's story isn't just about a mysterious boy. It's about the ways love sneaks into our lives through the cracks. It's about second chances and sacred silences. It's about how sometimes the most holy thing we can do is simply be with each other, in all our mess and mystery. And though Gabe never said where he came from or where he would go, those who encountered him carry his presence still. In quiet moments, in sudden joy, in the way a stranger's kindness can undo years of hurt. His story lingers not on paper or record, but in the hearts of those who chose to see, to believe, to remember. And maybe, just maybe, that's where all the best stories live. And so, the town of promise, once cloaked in silence and suspicion, now echoed with the songs of revival, not born from spectacle or man-made wonders, but from a single voice that dared to speak truth, a voice carried by one who claimed no glory for himself, but pointed always upward. They remembered the young man who walked among them not as a prophet with pomp and pride, but as Gabe, simple and strange, who listened more than he spoke and wept when they wept. His words were never dramatic, yet they pierced like lightning, not because they were clever, but because they were true. And when he stood before them under the waning light and said, "I am Gabriel, and remember, I am just a messenger," the weight of heaven settled on their hearts like morning dew on thirsty soil. It was not a declaration of power. It was a quiet surrender to a holy calling, and with it came the undeniable sense that the veil between earth and the divine had grown thin. The people didn't understand everything in that moment. They didn't suddenly become saints or scholars, but something had shifted. Something had broken loose in the spirit. The old arguments lost their fire. The cold stares became curious glances, then warm greetings. The church doors, which had long gathered dust, creaked open again, not from obligation, but invitation. Children laughed louder. Elders smiled more easily. Families who hadn't prayed together in years found themselves whispering thank yous at dinner tables and lifting tear-stained eyes to the heavens. It wasn't about the miracles, though small miracles did follow. It was about the presence, the knowing, the quiet confirmation that God had not forgotten them, that they were seen, that promise, as unlikely and overlooked as it was, still mattered in the story being written above. Some said Gabe was an angel, others called him mad. But those who truly saw him, those who looked past the strange clothes and the unassuming voice, recognized something ancient in his gaze. Not weariness, but wisdom. Not distance, but depth. He spoke of restoration as if it were not just possible, but already on the move. He called them back, not just to church or ritual, but to wonder, to trust, to faith like children standing at the edge of the sea. And when he left, he didn't promise to return. He simply blessed them. With eyes that held the fire of 1,000 suns and the gentleness of a dove, he said, "You know the way now. Walk in it." Then he was gone, just like that. No chariots of fire. No grand exit, only the lingering echo of hope. But oh, how that echo spread. Like ripples on a still lake, the sound of awakening moved from heart to heart, house to house. The tavern became a gathering place not for gossip, but for grace. The old widow, who hadn't left her home in years, now led the sunrise prayer walks. The mayor, once cold and skeptical, donated land for a new community garden. And on Sunday mornings, the air was filled not with silence or skepticism, but with song. Not all joined right away. Not all understood. But even the most doubtful found themselves wondering, could it be true? Could promise truly become what its name declared? And this is where the beauty of the story lies. Not in the arrival of an angel, but in what was awakened after. Gabe was never meant to stay. He was never the solution. He was the spark, the whisper, the reminder. That heaven still speaks, that God still sends. And that revival doesn't begin in the heavens, but in the humbled hearts of people who are willing to believe again. The scriptures say in Hebrews 13:2, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." And perhaps, just perhaps, that is what happened in Promise. Perhaps they entertained an angel, or perhaps they simply opened their hearts wide enough that God himself could walk among them. In the end, the town was never the same, but not because it became famous or wealthy or grand. It was because it became full of love, of light, of laughter, and of life. The curse they once believed in was broken, not by magic, but by mercy, not by force, but by faith. And every child born after that season was told the tale of the man named Gabe, who came not with thunder, but with truth, not to impress, but to invite. They were told of the turning, of the prayers that rose like incense, and the peace that settled like morning mist, of how a forgotten place became a flame that warmed the coldest hearts. And maybe that's what revival really is, not a spectacle but a slow bloom, a quiet return, a community rediscovering the sacred in the simple, the divine in the daily, a people who choose again and again to believe that God is not distant, but near, that his messengers still walk the earth. And that sometimes, when we least expect it, the promise of heaven arrives in the form of a stranger who reminds us who we are and whose we are. Let those who have ears to hear, hear. And let those who wait for a sign know this. The sign may already be among you. Maybe it looks like a neighbor who suddenly smiles a little brighter. Maybe it sounds like a child praying over dinner with fierce, innocent joy. Maybe it feels like forgiveness where there once was fury. Do not overlook the small things, for in the smallest, God often hides his greatest work. And if you ever find yourself in a town called Promise, or in a season that feels like one, remember this story. Remember Gabe. Remember the moment when heaven touched earth, not with noise, but with knowing. Not with thunder, but with tenderness. And may you too be ready to listen when the wind whispers truth and the spirit stirs again. In a world so desperate for answers, in a time where miracles feel like fading echoes of the past, there comes a story that shakes the dust off forgotten faith and breathes new life into weary souls. The story of Promise, Texas, isn't just about a small town nestled in the dry heartland of America. It's about all of us. It's about the hidden corners of our own hearts where doubt has taken root, where prayers have gone unanswered for so long we stopped believing they ever would be. But into this parched soil, something was planted, a whisper from heaven, a divine interruption in the form of a boy with no last name, no past, and a mission wrapped in silence and humility. Gabe didn't come with thunder or lightning. He didn't demand worship or recognition. He came with a mat, a message, and a heart full of grace. He came not to fix circumstances, but to restore relationships between man and God, between neighbor and friend, between the broken and the one who heals. When the rain finally fell on Promise, it wasn't just water touching the earth, it was heaven touching human hearts. It was a sign that the heavens had not closed their doors, that God had not turned his face away, and that restoration was still possible, even in the most barren of lands. Through Gabe, we saw what it means to pray, not as a ritual, but as a conversation with a living, loving God. We saw the power of authentic faith, not built on emotion or tradition, but born out of relationship. We saw miracles, not just in the resurrection of life and the healing of bodies, but in the revival of a town's soul. And through every step Gabe took, through every life he touched, through every moment of stillness where the divine slipped in unnoticed, we were reminded of one profound truth. God still moves. Think of Ellen, who once grieved in silence, now leading women in crafting prayer mats not just with thread and fabric, but with hope and purpose. Think of Joe, hardened by loss, rediscovering what it means to walk in the light of grace. Think of Cameron, whose second chance became a testimony louder than any sermon. Think of Lucy, who opened her eyes to the beauty of the world and to the power of faith. And even Brody, the skeptic, the sheriff weighed down by years of bitterness, faced his fears and stood before the truth he spent so long denying. Isn't that what grace looks like? Unmerited, unstoppable, undenied. This isn't just a feel-good movie. It's a mirror. It asks us to confront where we've shut God out, where we've grown numb to the miraculous, where we've chosen survival over surrender. Because Gabe didn't come to be the hero. He came to awaken the ones who had forgotten they were part of a greater story. He didn't come to perform magic tricks. He came to call us back. Back to the God who knows our name even when the world forgets us. Back to the prayers we gave up on. Back to the love that never left. And when Gabe said, "I am Gabriel," it wasn't about identity. It was a declaration that heaven still sends messengers, that we are not alone in our pain, that God is always speaking, always inviting, always redeeming. So what about you? What if this story isn't fiction, but a reflection of what God longs to do in your life right now? What if Promise, Texas, is more than a place? It's a condition of the soul. What if you've been walking through your own drought, waiting for your own rain, wondering if heaven has forgotten your name? Maybe Gabe came to remind you that you're not forgotten, that faith still matters, that prayer still works. That revival isn't just for towns in movies, but for hearts that dare to believe again. Don't let this be just another story you watch and walk away from. Let it be the turning point. Let it be your invitation to kneel, to speak, to cry out, and to hope. Miracles may not always come with flashing lights and dramatic music. Sometimes they come in silence, in whispers, in ordinary moments that are suddenly sacred. Sometimes they come in the form of a stranger with kind eyes and a rolled-up mat. Sometimes they come in the rain. Let this be your moment. Let this be your promise. And may the God who sees you, hears you, and loves you without condition meet you right where you are, because revival isn't coming, it's already here.